All right. Well, in that case, few minutes, we will jump right into today's webinar. I just want to say hello and good afternoon to all of you for joining us today. First off, thank you for taking the time to join us for the Filling the Gaps, Coming Together to Create Community Services webinar. Today, we'll discuss community service co-ops and how communities can utilize this co-op model to address local social, environmental, recreation, and health gaps. I'm excited to share that we're joined by some great guests who are all part of co-ops doing some fantastic things. We hear from individuals who will talk more about a community service co-op is helping to revive a beloved theater in southern Saskatchewan, how another group in Saskatchewan is using this model to run a retreat program for at-risk Indigenous girls, and how a group in BC is starting a community radio station that provides local content and a sense of community. Before we go any further, I'd like to start with a land acknowledgement. Co-operatives First operates on Treaty 6 territory, which is home of the Cree, Saulteaux, Dene, Dakota, Lakota, Nakota, and Métis nations. We acknowledge that this land was not ceded, but that the purpose of the treaties was to ensure the land would be shared. Indigenous peoples have been cooperating in these territories for thousands of years, and it is through the cooperation that all of our communities will continue to thrive. I encourage you, from wherever you are joining us today, to acknowledge and be mindful of the land you are currently on and those who call it home. I'm now going to introduce a little bit about Cooperatives First. So for those of you who may not be familiar, Cooperatives First is a nonprofit organization based in Saskatoon that supports entrepreneurs across Western Canada. Our organization is funded by Federated Cooperatives Limited and the cooperative retailing system to raise awareness of cooperatives and support the creation of new cooperative businesses. My name, for those of you who have not met me before, is Riley Hawkswood, and I'm the Community Engagement Coordinator for Cooperatives First. Working on the tech side and helping me with today's webinar is my colleague Jenna Pullen, our Manager of Engagement in British Columbia. Before we get to our guests, I want to share a little bit about what community service co-ops are. A community service co-op can be like any other co-op, where people come together to achieve a common goal. They are like a nonprofit organization in that their membership is usually open to anyone willing to support the co-op and be a part of its governance. Typically, they provide a service for the benefit of members and the wider community. Community service co-ops are used to address gaps in their community, and members play a large role in their operations and decision-making. Additionally, because these co-ops operate on a not-for-profit basis, they can apply for grants and government funding that may not be available to nonprofit co-ops. Community service co-ops can address local needs that are overlooked by big businesses or government. These co-ops ensure that the services they provide address the unique requirements of their own community. This type of co-op is flexible, and we've seen groups use this structure to create things such as childcare spaces, offer supports to vulnerable and homeless populations, build seniors housing, and more. This is just the tip of the iceberg of how they can address gaps in communities. And today, we will hear more about that from our panelists. Allow me to introduce our three panelists for today's webinar. We have Scott Weir from Golden Co-op Radio. Scott is one of the proud founders of Golden Co-op Radio and has helped to build the organization from day one. He is a big believer in building community institutions and loves cooperatives for their ability to ground important services in the community that they are built for. Scott brings his years of board experience with other organizations, as well as his years in the financial sector and as a small business owner to the board of Golden Co-op Radio. Welcome, Scott. Thanks for joining us today. Awesome. Next, and also joining us today is Sean Purdue from the Weyburn Theater Community Service Co-op. Sean is a senior wealth advisor with Aviso Wealth, a partner company of Weyburn Credit Union. His role involves creating comprehensive financial plans and building and managing investment portfolios for affluent families, working closely with farm families and business owners. He and his wife have called Weyburn home for more than 20 years and enjoy raising their 3 children in Southeast Saskatchewan. Sean has been involved with several nonprofit organizations in Weyburn, 3 of which were born from grassroots ideas and have filled important needs within the community. Welcome, Sean, and thank you as well for joining us today.
Thanks for having me.
Awesome. And last, but certainly not least, we have a familiar guest, Cathy Edwards from Heartland Community Services Co-operative. Cathy is a serial entrepreneur from Saskatoon, Saskatchewan. She holds a Bachelor of Commerce degree from the University of Saskatchewan and a law degree. Just one second here. And holds a law degree from the University of Calgary. She has worked professionally in large corporate environments and clerked for the Courts of Queen's Bench and Appeal for the province of Alberta, and practiced at notable law firms in Alberta and Saskatchewan. Cathy left private practice to pursue entrepreneurial ventures and hasn't looked back. She has a passion for startups and has successfully launched and managed several ventures, including a nonprofit cooperative. She also supports startups at Cooperatives First as our entrepreneur in residence. She was awarded the YWCA Woman of Distinction Award for Entrepreneurship in 2023 and leads our innovative project to create childcare co-ops across the prairies. Thank you for joining us as well today, Cathy. Awesome. So with that, I was thinking, thank you, of course, for joining us and sharing about your co-ops. I'm excited to have you all share about the things your co-ops are doing. We'll keep this fairly conversational. For today's webinar, I'll ask a set of questions aimed at helping each of you share a little bit about the co-op, in which the 3 of you can take turns answering the questions. I'll follow the order that I introduced the 3 of you, starting with Scott, then Sean, and then Cathy when answering the questions. After the final questions, we will then start the Q&A period with the attendees. I'll start with the first question to kind of break the ice, although I already asked the previous 4 questions, and then we can jump right into answering questions from attendees with the time we have left. I ask that if anyone has any questions, please drop them in the chat function. Jenna and I will try our best to make sure that we get to as many questions as possible. But with that, let's jump right in. So for the first question, how did your group identify the gap or need in your community that led to starting a co-op? And how did the group decide that a community service co-op was the right solution to fill that gap? We'll start with you, Scott.
Sure. So Golden Co-operative formed out of
Oh, you're muted, Scott.
Sorry, I did click the mute function, but obviously not well enough. Thank you. So Golden Co-operative formed, I believe in 2021 was when we got everything kicked off. And that was formed out of, at that time, so for a little bit of context, I'm from Golden. Golden has about 4,000 residents. We are like about 3 hours away from a major urban center and about 2 hours away from kind of other similar sized towns. So we're fairly remote. We are also at the edge of the BC border. So our actual closest reasonable sized city is Calgary, which is kind of weird from a cultural perspective as well. So Golden, we are a town of Facebook users, and we have a radio station, just a single one, I guess. And then in addition, we have the rebroadcast of the CBC from Kelowna or Kamloops. And back in 2021, Bell, who owns many small rural stations, decided that ours was one of the ones that they wanted to fire all of the staff from and just rebroadcast regional programming on. And that was unfortunate because our radio station plays a fairly significant emergency preparedness role for our community, as well as just one of the few forms of mass communication. Like everyone listens to the radio here, everyone has it on in their car, every business in town has the radio on. And so you can literally walk down our main street and go into a series of businesses, and you're just going to hear the same song playing as you go into each one. So there is sort of a binding cultural component to that. So when we found out that the one local staff that we had that did the morning show had been laid off, and that we were no longer going to have even that base component, like that bare minimum of a locality to our radio station, I started looking into how hard it was to start a community radio station. And this is going off of looking at inspirations like CJSW, the campus community radio station at the University of Calgary, um, but also many others like the Smithers radio station, and most notably um, Kootenai Co-op Radio out of Nelson, who's probably in many ways our biggest inspiration and has been around for like 30 years now. So kudos to them. So I started looking into it, figured out that yes, it is viable, but it really does need to be done as a cooperative or a nonprofit society, because it just is a difficult industry to make money in as a for-profit entity. And also too, the cultural component and the wanting to be able to have our voices out there, and make it accessible to amateurs that want to create shows and stuff was a major component of the inspiration. So from there, after a couple of weeks of research of kind of figuring out what the baseline base requirements of a radio station would be, I put together a feasibility, kind of like I called it a capacity survey essentially, and shared it on our local community groups to basically see if we had the right people with the right skills out there to be able to slot into the requirements that would be necessary to get through things like the complicated CRTC requirements, the Industry Canada requirements, and all of the different pieces that are necessary to actually form a radio station. Not to mention actually making sure we had volunteer and board capacity to run another organization in town. Because I don't know what it's like in your given communities, but certainly in Golden, we have a core of people that run many of our nonprofits, me being one of them, that are often on a variety of boards. And so to just say, hey, let's start another organization that requires a volunteer board, it's not necessarily guaranteeing the viability of it or that you'll find people. But one thing I was very proud of with this organization is I think because of it being a fun and interesting thing, we were able to bring in, and also maybe also the way that I approached it to start bringing in people, we were able to find people that are competent and awesome people that just needed some additional governance training. And suddenly they were new additions to that kind of governance and volunteering pool in our community. So true capacity building, and they hopefully will go on. And I think we've seen this in the last couple of years, have gone on to also be involved in other organizations as well. And that's ultimately what we hope for as a cooperative movement, right? Is to build a greater capacity for community. So I think that's enough on that question for now.
Awesome. Awesome. Thanks, Scott, for sharing about that. Sean, please.
I'm kind of jealous of Scott's backdrop there.
This isn't even the nice one. This is a highway.
Yeah, I can see that. Yeah, it looks great to me. Thanks again for the invitation, Riley. So like Scott, we are in a small community. Weyburn is home to about 11,000 residents in Southeast Saskatchewan. So how did we identify this need? Well, we you know what, Weyburn was home to a single screen movie theater known as the Sioux Cinema or the Sioux Theater for decades. So the building had been around since the 50s, had been operated by a few different operators. And of course, a building that old over time, starts to disintegrate, and it needed some attention. So as time went by, the current owner, which was Landmark Cinemas, they had been kind of pumping a little bit of money into it to keep it going. And finally, in 2017, they made the decision to stop doing that, and they decided to close the doors. So of course, it left a huge gap in our community. A movie theater is a pretty important entertainment option in really any community, but certainly a community this size should have a movie theater. Large chains like Landmark, like Cineplex, they really weren't interested in constructing a new theater in our community. They're more interested in large format cinemas, kind of 8 screens or more, which obviously isn't really a fit for a community of Weyburn size. So this forced people to travel. We've got a couple of theaters, Regina is about an hour away. We've got a city called Estevan that's not quite an hour away. They both have movie theaters, and that's fine. It's not too terribly far to travel, but what we're finding is, and I mean, I can speak to this myself. When you go to a movie in those places, number one, you're not going to go see a movie as frequently because you do have to travel. Number two, when I take my family there, we're going to go out for supper, and maybe we'll do a little bit of shopping before we go catch a flick.
Make sure that our current customer
There's
guys or our new customer.
everyone else getting that, or is that just me? Sorry.
Is
So
it possible to
there's a
mute the audience?
United States government unless you have that. So it's imperative.
So there's economic leakage that comes with that, right? Money that's being spent in other communities and not ours. So some local community members, they toyed with the idea of maybe reopening the Sioux in the former location. The building was still standing, and it needed a lot of work, but some community members had kind of thought about reopening it. But I think after they did a little bit of digging, they quickly abandoned that idea. The movie theater business is very unique and very specialized. So, given that, nobody ultimately wanted to take it on, not to mention the real scale of, either repairing the former building or building a new one. So really the community sat in limbo for a few years. Everybody lamented the fact that we didn't have a movie theater, but it's, like I said, it's a very difficult venture to kind of take on and try to reestablish. So, and also, like, it's hard to figure out where to start with these types of projects, as everybody on this call can probably relate to. So that's kind of where we stood, and maybe I'll leave the rest of my story for the next questions.
Awesome. Thanks for sharing the beginning of that, Sean. And we'll move it to Cathy here to share a little bit herself.
Thanks so much, Riley. It's always so inspiring to hear everyone's stories. I'll have to apologize. I am recovering from a cold, so I kind of have a smoky jazz singer voice today, but it is not definitely my natural voice. Pardon me. So heart-linked really, the phrase I think of when I think about how we came to found Heart-Linked was the phrase that necessity is the motherhood of all invention. And I have a lifelong friend who has committed her professional career to working in northern communities. So it was very interesting to have someone sort of entrenched and on the ground, firsthand experiencing some of the cultural and other challenges that were faced by a number of youth living in those northern communities. And back in 2016, 2017, there was the very unfortunate experience of suicide clusters. So what was happening is groups of young girls particularly were making pacts to complete suicide together. And unfortunately, many of them were successful. The challenge was that there was a lot of media attention and discussion about a lot of federal and provincial dollars coming down the pipeline for aid. And what's really interesting is when you have someone who's connected actually in the community, the process for that help to actually reach the people who need it is very convoluted and often takes a channel that ends up not being effective. So realistically, it was a group of moms. And so everyone says, how are you involved in a cooperative that delivers mental health services. And I have no mental health background, like you said, I'm an entrepreneur, but I kind of like to think of myself as a fixer. So it was a group of women, a group of moms who got together and said, okay, we see a problem. We don't see any mechanism that is actually shoulder tapping the individuals who need the shoulder tap. Is there something that we could do? So we collaborated with the Northern Lights School Division and just put forward an idea. And we said, look, identify one school right now that's in crisis, and identify some girls who you think would benefit from just a break. And we put them on a bus and we brought them to Saskatoon for a retreat. And that's really how the whole program was born. So it was really one of those situations where, the comment that, you ask the busiest person in the room when you want to get something done, that resonates when you see the same community members on boards. But what was different about this is that, it was a group from outside of the community that saw that the community was stretched and didn't have the resources. So we kind of came in and said, how can we help? So everything that we've done since then has been in collaboration with the northern communities we work with. And I think that, not to go too far down the pathway of the next question, but that's why the cooperative mechanism or organization type really appealed to us, because it's about working together and collaborating to solve a problem.
Awesome. Thank you for just sharing on that first question. I recognize that all three of the groups are really doing very impactful work in the communities that they're in. And it kind of just leads to my next question, and it kind of blended into the first one on a little bit, but what was the process of incorporation like for your group? And, even just to touch on it a little bit more, what was enticing about the community service co-op model as well when going through incorporation? We'll start with you once again, Scott.
Sure. So that kind of capacity survey that I had talked about. So once we had quite a good response through that. Probably about 50 people responded through it, and of those people, there's a certain amount of people that had responded that they'd be interested in helping to actually be organizers within that. So we ended up bringing a lot of those people together. And just at each kind of stage of this too, you see sort of like a funneling process, right? So you get people that'll respond to the survey, but then when you actually follow up with them, you maybe get this amount of people. Then when it comes to actually showing up for a meeting, you get this amount. And then you get to a group that's usually like a core group, and they're usually in it for the long haul. And so we eventually had that core group, and it was a ragtag group of a bunch of us that had never met before, which is great. And we started doing a lot of the research that was necessary, starting to do the groundwork for these things. We also took a training session through, was it through cooperatives first? It might have been through cooperatives first, or yeah, I think it was through cooperatives first. Like a 6-week program on how to build a co-op, essentially, which was great. I had some background in that, but a lot of the other people did not. And so it was a really good way to kind of bring everyone to having a common understanding of what a co-op was and why it would be beneficial to us. We did, of course, look at things like forming like a nonprofit society as an alternative to that. But there are definitely pros and cons with each one. And frankly, they're very similar. But the advantage of having a co-op is that it is that kind of one member, one vote. You do have sort of a share within the co-op. And there's also just like you're tied into a really cool network as far as like the cooperative movement and stuff like that. There is also downsides though, as we'll probably talk about later, is like lots of government agencies and funding organizations have no idea what a co-op is. And it can actually get in the way of funding at times. So there's definitely things you can do to like work with that and help with that, but you don't necessarily, as a nonprofit cooperative, you don't necessarily have the advantage of a for-profit cooperative of being able to pull in equity and or pull in like lending from your membership, and which is one of the advantages of starting up when you're in a for-profit cooperative. anyways, I'm getting off topic here. So we ended up using cooperatives first to actually help us through the incorporation process. And it was probably about 6 months into us forming as a group that we actually became an official cooperative, had our first kind of AGM essentially, and kind of moved forward from that point.
Thanks. Sean, share next, please.
Yeah, so so keeping in mind our theater closed in 2017, in 2021, the manager of our local chamber of commerce, at that time it was a guy by the name of Larry Higgs. He had heard of cooperatives first, and the work they were doing with groups from around the country. And he thought, you know what, maybe there's an opportunity to, to kind of reach out to them and see if they can help us with this. So before that, though, we really didn't have a committee formed. We had nothing. So Larry had conversations with a few of us, in the grocery store or wherever it might have been. Knew that a handful of us were pretty interested in bringing it back to Weyburn. So he had reached out to a few of us, pulled us together. We had some meetings with cooperatives first, and I guess they determined that we qualified for a feasibility study, which was a really important component of this whole process, just to deter, does this thing actually work, right? So cooperatives first, they partnered us with a very energetic and enthusiastic lady by the name of Cathy Edwards. And Cathy, we got to know Cathy pretty well over the next year or two. So she shared our enthusiasm for the project. She jumped in with both feet, really led the charge on the feasibility study. And we ended up coming up with a feasibility study that showed that, yeah, you know what, this community can support a 2 to 3 screen cinema. It would be economically viable. So kind of during the feasibility study stage, we received support from cooperatives first to incorporate as a community service co-op. So, they really did all the heavy lifting. Kyle, I think, was pretty involved in that process. And we paid the costs associated with that, but that was kind of it. And like I said, they did all the heavy lifting. So that was fantastic. Another milestone. So we officially incorporated in October of 2021. And I mean, from the outset, I think if we're being honest with ourselves and with the group that's on the call today, I don't know that any of us thought that a cooperative model made a lot of sense for a movie theater in Southeast Saskatchewan. We were just happy that there was an organization that was kind of willing to partner with us and help us get this thing off the ground. But you know what? As time went by, I think we realized that a community service co-op actually makes a lot of sense for our project. So the history of co-ops is, they come into communities and they help to fill gaps. And we have a gap in our community right now. And I guess that's what we're striving to fill. So is it non-traditional? I think absolutely. I'm not sure if you'd find another community service co-op or cooperative model movie theater in Saskatchewan or Western Canada, or maybe even Canada. Maybe there are some out there, but I'm not sure. So certainly for what we're trying to accomplish, it makes a lot of sense. We're excited to, kind of continue and we don't have members yet, which I'll talk about more in a second, but that'll be kind of a next major step for us.
Awesome. Yeah, thanks, Sean. I would like to also say that I don't believe there's also another cooperative theater in Saskatchewan at the very least. In Western Canada, might be beyond my knowledge, but nonetheless very cool. And Cathy, what was the process of incorporation like for your group, and why community service co-op model?
So for us, like I said, we started at a very ad hoc level. I ran to Costco and someone else went and bought fleece blankets, and we just sort of pieced this together as best we could. But what we realized is that the need was so deep that immediately this program resonated within a number of northern communities, and immediately we were getting emails from other social workers or counselors in communities like, how do we participate in this? So that naturally led to the next steps of, we have to start finding some funding. And you need to be legally organized, and particularly legally organized as a not-for-profit, in order to access meaningful sources of funding. So we realized we needed to take that next step in terms of legitimacy. At the time that we were incorporating, I really didn't have any exposure to cooperatives first. And it was actually one of our other co-founding members who came across it through just a search engine. And she said, this is a really unique model. And what's different for us is that often the membership of a cooperative also enjoys its services, which is kind of the classical model, if you think of it that way. Whereas in our cooperative, our membership supports services to others. So it's sort of a different approach. But what really deeply resonated with us was two things. Number one, it was free access to awesome services. So that was my first experience, was an introduction to Kyle, who's our director of education. And even though I have a legal background and I'm one of those people who I'm doing a million things, and they made the process easy and accessible. So that was really important to us. But also we really loved, it resonated deeply with us, this whole concept that cooperation in our minds also hearkened to the word collaboration. And that's really what we're all about. We didn't want to be perceived as going in and trying to fix things in communities. We wanted to be perceived as, we're here with a certain set of resources. How can we help you? You tell us what you need. And it's that level of collaboration that is sort of at the foundation of our cooperative.
Thank you. Coming into the last few questions here. One of the next one is, what did the early stages of operating a co-op look like for your group? And maybe still in that stage or moving past it. Also, what were some of the biggest challenges that you faced or are facing? We'll start with Scott.
So I think that the early challenges of this type of co-op are probably the same ones that anyone that has been involved in the early stages of any nonprofit society probably has run into. So you often run into issues of trying to constantly putting the cart before the horse, essentially, and trying to operate things and move ahead, kind of push too many balls up a hill, essentially. And that often can lead to governance issues where you don't have policies in place to kind of govern you, essentially. But probably the bigger thing is you run into capacity issues. You very quickly run the risk of people burning out, because you're just trying to get a lot of stuff done, and you haven't necessarily built the capacity, and you don't necessarily have any staff or really even sufficient funding. But the purpose of the organization is there, and you're driven by that. And so that can keep you going for a while. It's kind of like, I don't know, you're kind of running on fumes for a long period of time. And it doesn't probably have to be that way, but in my experience, that's often how it is for early nonprofits of any shape. With co-ops, you do have like a lot of support structures in terms of like a lot of resources and a lot of like kind of a community to be able to pull on. But that doesn't ultimately change the fact that you've just got a lot of work to do. So sorry, Riley, can you repeat the question? I just want to make sure I'm adequately answering it before we move
Yeah,
on.
for sure. What did the early stages of operating a co-op look like for your group? And then I kind of tacked on what were some of the bigger challenges or challenges faced in those stages?
Yeah, sure. Okay, so yeah, I think we very early on we kind of divided up into a couple of like working committees essentially to address different things. So some of us like there was like a finance committee, there was a establishment committee which worked on kind of all of our governance and policy components. and just kind of board capacity building and organization capacity building. And then there was also an infrastructure committee, which was really looking at like all of the regulations and all of the like physicality of how do you actually broadcast? Like, how does that work? How do you get towers? Where do you put towers? What do you need to be able to, what do you need in order to actually be doing that? How does all this infrastructure work? Because surprise, surprise, there's not that many people working in radio anymore. That's why it works really well as a service cooperative, because you kind of have to reinvent some of the stuff. And sometimes, and through this process, we were able to find a bunch of them. You come across people that have been working in radio for a really long time and know a lot of these like kind of like end-to-end components. And once you find one of those, that's great. But we ran into lots of different things. Like you always get like some early conflicts in the group and stuff too, of people having different ideas of where to go on things, or people working really hard to move the organization forward, and others being perceived to not pull their weight or actually being obstructive, right? And so these are just things that come up with any organization of people, and so you have to figure out ways of working through that. Um, yeah, so I think that would be my answer to it. Overall, though, we really had a successful first couple of years. We were able to secure a large subsidized station space in the basement of our library in the middle of town, that we only pay like $1,200 a year in rent for, even though it's like several thousand square feet, which is great. And we also just recently, so this is several years later, but we just got a huge grant to be able to renovate the space, to turn it into sound booths, turn it into an event space, do all the things that our membership and our community will really benefit from. We did get hit though with not probably about a year and a half into forming as a cooperative. The CRTC decided to put a 2-year pause on all new applications. Like just anyone that's applying to have a radio station, you're just not able to for 2 years. And it's like an 18-month process at best once you get your paperwork in. So it suddenly delayed us for 3 years. So it kind of threw us into an existential crisis. And so we took it as an opportunity, though, to really focus in on building our board capacity and building our community capacity and doing all of those kind of foundational groundwork things, so that when the CRTC pause was finished, which it's coming up to that now, then we'd be able to hit the ground running with a much stronger organization. And so far, so good. We just had our third AGM back in March. We successfully, I'm basically, yeah, I think I'm the only board member that switched over from the previous group. Just a variety of, some people started businesses, others had other things to move on to. But we did have also one person who previously was on our board, just not this last cycle, rejoin, and then a bunch of new people come on that had been involved through programming and stuff. So it's really great to see. It's a big step whenever you have a transition of your board and volunteers, without it being like without that being an existential crisis. So that's a nice like base level of maturity that our organization seems to have hit. So okay, that's enough of me talking. Thanks.
That's great. It's great to hear in the latter half there, the things that are happening now for the co-op. That's great. In the case of, with every co-op, I think the idea of burnout, or just the idea that everybody who is a part of that steering committee that first starts a co-op, I think everybody wears all the hats and they all work together, and so it's felt by everybody. And so it's definitely something we see a lot with groups for sure. But yeah, thanks for sharing with that, Scott. Sean, what did the early stages of operating co-op look like for your group? And what are some of the current or biggest challenges you're facing or have faced?
Yeah, sure. So we're not operational yet. So I can't provide probably a great answer to that question. I can maybe give you a bit of an update as to where we're at today. So we have yet to break ground on our new building. We've made a ton of progress, obviously. We've raised about $1.3 million. mostly in the form of local, well, entirely in the form of local sponsorships, some large scale sponsorships, entirely from local businesses and local families. Late last year, we selected a construction partner to kind of, help us continue along this path. We're very, very heavy in the design phase right now. Probably complete or largely complete the design phase. We recently released a color rendering of the new facility, and kind of relaunched a sponsorship campaign that we had going about a year ago. I don't know if you guys care if I'm able to do it, but I can but I'm happy to share a picture of it if I'm able to, Riley. Cathy's giving me thumbs up because I don't know if she's seen it yet, or maybe she has. I can do that at the end. So, am I good? No, that's okay. Good now?
I just made you a co-host, so you should be able to share a picture on your screen.
So this is our rendering of the new facility.
Whoa.
Super, super excited. So up until recently, we only had a floor plan and, kind of some preliminary exterior elevations and things like that. So this will be a 2-screen cinema. Obviously very modern looking, but a little bit of a nostalgic flair to kind of match what we have going on in downtown Weyburn. As far as next steps, our plans are currently with the engineers. They have to, kind of review them, put their stamp on them, recommend any changes that are necessary. And from there, our construction partner can go and begin to collect quotes from subtrades, and then we can get a real idea what the cost on this thing is going to be. Cathy had done a ton of work for us to give us an idea of, what a facility like this could cost to construct. But we really don't know the number yet. And we're, anticipating it's certainly going to be higher than what our initial estimates were, because almost 3 years have passed since then. So we need to get to that point before we know whether or not we're at a stage where we can get shovels in the ground this year, or whether we need to continue our fundraising efforts. We know we're going to have to carry some debt to build this thing, and then, gradually kind of pay it down over time. But we want to be on solid financial footing before we do that. So that's how the building looks. Challenges, I really just echo a lot of what Scott said. But I think anybody who's been involved in any sort of nonprofit work experiences very similar challenges, especially when you're starting from the ground up. So I don't think I'll rehash that, and we can probably throw it over to Cathy.
Thanks so much, Sean. That's very exciting. I hadn't seen the renderings yet, and mark my words, I will be in line for popcorn on opening night. So our little cooperative doesn't have any of those big insurmountable challenges like fundraising for a building or figuring out how to access radio or put up radio towers. But for us, one of the first challenges we had, as I mentioned, which, necessitated us becoming a legal organization, was to find funding that was significant enough to meet the demands that we were facing, because we were a really unique program and we knew we were delivering something impactful. And it was, Scott alluded to it, sometimes the cooperative model isn't recognized when you look at funding streams. And for us, more so, we found we were always in competition with charities, or some of the funds that we were seeking required us to have charitable status. So that was a big challenge for us. And we still maintain that becoming a charity is actually, it's a challenging process. And it's also not very cost effective for a small organization, due to the financial constraints of having to go through an audit and a number of other significant financial exercises every year. So we kind of had to think outside the box. And what we did to solve those problems was align with partners who do have charitable status. And our key one is the Northern Lights School Division. And So that by partnering with them and some other charitable organizations within the communities we serve, we've been able to collectively go after some of that significant funding and secure it. So that's been really fantastic. And that was one way we kind of overcame some of the initial hurdles. One of the other ones that I want to mention is that sometimes I think people are hesitant to put their hand up to participate on a board. They really like what you're doing and what you're all about, but being on a board of directors can sometimes be a daunting exercise. People think, oh, formality and meetings and all of those things, what is this all about? So I, not to be biased, but I'd love to again tip my hat to the folks at Co-operatives First, because the board basics and all of the workshops, even though we had a board that was pretty well professionally decorated, everybody eagerly participated in going through those workshops, and it really brought us together, and it made it feel manageable and accessible, so that when we are introducing a new board member, no matter what walk of life they come from, we want to integrate as many voices as possible, and those materials make it really easy to do so.
Awesome. Awesome. Thank you all for sharing. And Sean for showing that rendering. The rendering looks great. Like Cathy, I guess I'll be second in line for popcorn when it opens. But in that case, final question before we get to the Q&A here, because we're coming up on close to time. Just a quick update on the current of the co-op today and what it is doing now. I know, Sean, you mentioned what the co-op's going through and what they're doing right now, but and Scott, even just a little bit yourself, but would you like to elaborate a little bit on the current of the co-op today and what's going on? Awesome.
Yeah, so Golden Co-op Radio, like I said, we just had I think it was our third full AGM, with the first one where it was just the forming one, not necessarily counting. So our AGMs are very well attended. I think we have about 140 paid members, and we get about 50, 60 people showing up to our AGMs. We have live music and stuff. It is like, we make it more of a thing. It's more interesting than like, I'm also on the board of our credit union, AGM, for example. No less important, but like the credit union could learn from it. And we have an annual block party that we've started doing. So we're now in our second year of holding the block party. We have food, we have entertainment, we do raffle. It's meant as a fundraiser for us, but it's also a member engagement component as well. And last year we had about 150 people show up. This year we hit like 300, 400 people over the course of the 5-hour event. So it's a big deal. It's becoming like a bit of a cultural phenomena for us. We also have like probably 16 different people involved in show creation. So we make it very accessible to create shows on the radio. So we have, like, for example, one of our newest shows is like, we have a dystopian book club that these two women are doing called Brave Girls New World, which is excellent. And it has to be a late night show because it's like kind of inappropriate, but hilarious. And we have like a 14-year-old that has started doing a 90s Brit, or no, an 80s Brit pop hour. It's like, this music's way before you were born. But anyways, that's cool, whatever. And so there's just like all these cool different shows that are going on of people that really are just doing it because they love X topic or X music. I had a folk show called All Right Folks. That was fun for a while. And then I realized, oh no, I'm way too involved in everything else. This is exhausting. So yeah, we have active programming. The station is running. We started rolling out ads recently, which is nice, because it is a bit of revenue. We also do cooperative coffee sales. So we have a co-op that we partner with that brings in coffee from a cooperative of farmers in Guatemala. So it's co-op selling to co-op selling through co-ops, and it's a good fun. It's how they make their income, and we also make a bit of a fundraiser off of it, and so that kind of works well. But I should note, though, we are not actually on the airwaves right now. We are only an online radio station. So all of you can go and listen, though. goldencoopradio.ca, you can see all of our stuff. But yeah, we still have a long road to be able to broadcast. Anyone that's interested in actually setting up a community radio station, just so you know, the average time looking at our peers across the country, it's like 4 to 6 years to go from starting to finishing one of these things. Like it's insane. So keeping the momentum up during that period is a real challenge. But so far, so good. So that's where we're currently at, and we'll have these renos started and finished by the end of the year, which is super exciting. So
That's a great update. I love to hear that, and so many different things being offered. That's great. One note, Kyle White, their director of education, and I actually listened to the station a few weeks ago online. So definitely available for folks if they want to check it out. But Cathy, please share a little bit of an update of the current of the co-op.
You bet. Well, I'll keep it short and sweet because I think there's some questions that folks may want to be asking. But we're continuing to grow. We've just rolled out a pilot project where we're now able to move programming into the grade 7 classroom. Our current focus has always been grade 6. But what's really unique about many northern communities is that high school starts in grade 7. So equipping these young female or female identifying folks with some tools in their toolboxes to see other choices for themselves is really important. So we're continuing to grow. And a lot of that has been helped thanks to the great foundation that Cooperatives First help us build.
Awesome. Sean, any other thoughts or final things you'd like to update before we hop into the Q&A?
Nope, I think we can jump into the Q&A.
Awesome. Well, we're going to skip my question because I asked plenty, got great answers. We'll jump right into some of the questions folks asked in the chat. So we have Chantel who asked, after one of Sean's answers, how do you manage accountability and decision making, especially when customers may complain or have concerns? To take the somewhat of a lead on this one a little bit, with a cooperative, the decision making in large part is with the board of directors. In that case, though, with accountability, the board of directors are comprised of the members of the co-op, and those board of directors are voted in by the members. So they're not only a representation of the members, but they're also voted in by members. So when things are brought up and accountability needs to be measured, it's the board of directors that make those kind of decisions and deal with those kinds of things. But they're also members, so they're aware of some of the things coming up and that they're directly in the process and the operations of the co-op. But I'll also throw this out to the group, specifically all three of you. How do you manage accountability and decision making, even in the case when customers may complain or have concerns? We'll start with you, Cathy.
Well, that's a challenging question for me to answer because we don't really have customers, so to speak. But what we do is we continue to operate, like I said, very collaboratively and with open feedback. So we have had concerns raised by some community members about, whether or not a certain activity would be received well by their community. And it's all about open, honest feedback and dialogue. And I think coming from my business background and having clients, again, it's that open dialogue that often communication often solves 99% of problems.
Awesome. Sean?
Well, I'll maybe piggyback off of Cathy's answer. We're not operational yet, so we haven't had, necessarily, complaints about the business, but we get a lot of questions from community members. So, we're certainly very accountable to the community for, and our large corporate sponsors. So we try to keep them well updated in terms of, our progress and, kind of answer any questions or address any potential concerns before they're brought up to us, if that's possible. Because timelines, of course, on these projects get a little bit stretched and people rightfully so get maybe a little antsy in terms of, when is this thing going to start? So yeah, we're accountable to the community and we just try to, communication, I guess, is important, and that's what we try to do.
Thanks. And Scott?
Yeah, just quick thing on that. So everything is obviously accountable to the board, but then ultimately the board is accountable to your membership, largely through AGMs. Now, the practicality of that is a whole other thing. But we have had to pass a number of bylaws bylaw changes at the AGM, specific around like somewhat contentious things like the removal of board members, not of current ones, but like the policies that allow for removal, because we didn't have good structures in place for that initially. And so that was definitely something where amongst 50 people, we then had to like explain why the board thought that was necessary. Here's why that's the case. But just setting that aside for a moment though, the biggest thing is it's a co-op. People want to be involved in it. And therefore newsletters and communication with your membership is absolutely critical. Our readership for our newsletter, which we send out at least one a month, if not a couple of months, and then we also do a lot of social media stuff, has incredibly high readership. Like we're talking about like 75 to 85%, which is unheard of for newsletters generally. So people want to hear from you, and so it's worth spending the time and effort, even in the early stages of the organization where you don't have that time, to make sure that you are communicating progress with people.
Awesome. We're getting close to end of time. We got time for one more. I will say the questions we don't get to, I will make sure that we answer in an email back to folks, just so that their questions do feel answered. We don't want to leave anyone out. But the last question, what does your membership structure look like? And how did you decide who your members would be? Well, the alternate option, we'll start with you again, Scott.
The open membership, anyone can buy a membership. It's $20. And because we're an online radio station, we'll eventually be broadcasting on FM, anyone can listen to it. So feel free to become a member. I think we do technically have a requirement where you have to be a BC resident. So that probably isn't relevant for a lot of people on this call, but we probably also won't check it. So feel free to become a member. So we obviously have to check it.
Thanks. Sean?
So we haven't begun our membership drive, if you want to call it that. Our membership currently just consists of our board members. That is something that's on the horizon for us. And as we get closer to being operational, it'll be open to anybody who wants to be a member.
Thanks.
And Cathy?
Well, membership for us looks like anybody who wants to feel like they're part of a movement. And again, to nod to the cooperative model, when you write a check to donate to a cause that you believe in, you feel good, but buying a membership and then continuing to support through either volunteer efforts and being kept abreast of what's going on in the organization and being invited to an annual general meeting, it creates more of a sense of community. And that's really what our membership is all about. So we keep the bar low so that it's accessible to all. It's $25. You can buy a lifetime membership, and many of our supporters have done that. But it's really more about a call to community that the membership is all about.
Awesome. Big thank you to our three panelists, Cathy, Scott, and Sean. And really a big thanks to everyone on the call for joining us today. We hope this webinar has provided you with insights and new ideas for tackling social gaps in your community. If you are interested in starting a community service co-op or learning more, Cooperatives First, we can help. Reach out to myself or anyone on our team, and we can help you start that conversation. That kind of wraps up today's webinar. It was great. I appreciate all the questions and everyone reaching out. If questions come up, feel free to reach out to myself and send me an email, and I can gladly help out. But thank you everyone for being a part of this today.